That morning, I was sipping my coffee, enjoying the quiet hum of my home when the power suddenly cut out. At first, I thought it was just a routine outage, maybe some work being done down the street, but when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my blood boil. A white utility truck was parked right outside my fence, and standing next to it, barking orders like she was leading a military operation, was none other than Karen, the president of our ever-dreaded HOA. She was dressed in her usual pastel blazer, clutching a clipboard like it was a royal decree, her nose high in the air as she talked to the utility worker, waving her hand dramatically toward my house. I marched right over, demanding to know what was going on, and that's when she gave me that fake, condescending smile. "Oh dear," she cooed, as if she were talking to a misbehaving toddler. "Your property has been in violation of HOA standards for months. Your outdoor shed? It clashes with the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. And since you refused to comply with our guidelines, we had no choice but to take action. It's just a temporary disconnection until you make the necessary changes." I could feel the heat rising in my face, my hands clenching into fists. My shed? That tiny wooden structure at the back of my property? I had lived here longer than half the people in this HOA. That shed had been standing there since before Karen had even learned how to abuse her position. "You cut off my power because of a shed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen sighed dramatically, as if I was exhausting her. "It's not just a shed, dear. It's your refusal to follow community standards. We sent multiple notices. This is simply a gentle nudge to encourage compliance." She then had the audacity to pat my arm like she was doing me a favor before turning on her heel and walking back toward the utility truck. "Now, once you fix your violations and pay the reinstatement fee, we'll be happy to turn it back on. But in the meantime, I suggest you learn to follow the rules." I stood there, stunned, watching as she strutted away like she had just handed down some royal decree. The utility worker, clearly uncomfortable, avoided my gaze as he climbed into his truck and drove off, leaving me standing in my own driveway, completely powerless, literally and figuratively. That's when the anger set in. Karen had pushed too far this time. I had put up with her ridiculous fines, her pointless rules, her constant meddling. But this was war. She wanted to make my life miserable? Fine. But she had no idea who she was messing with. I wasn't some pushover who would roll over and take it. If Karen thought she could bully me, she was about to learn a very painful lesson. I went back inside and grabbed my laptop, doing a little digging. Karen loved to act like she was untouchable, but I knew one thing for sure. Power flowed both ways. And as it turned out, the HOA's office line, their entire little command center, was connected to a private utility pole, one that ran straight through my property. A pole they had never actually gotten proper permission to use. I smiled. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was about to show her how it was really done. I made a quick call to my lawyer, a no-nonsense guy named Bill who had a special talent for tearing apart HOA nonsense. After explaining the situation, I asked one simple question. "Can I cut off their power?" Bill chuckled. "Legally, if it's on your property and they don't have an easement for it, you can do whatever you want." That was all I needed to hear. The next morning, bright and early, I made my move. I hired a private electrician, someone who wasn't under the HOA's thumb, to come and disconnect the HOA office from my utility pole. It was done in less than an hour. No drama, no big spectacle, just a quiet little flip of a switch, and suddenly, Karen's little empire was running on fumes. By noon, I started getting calls. HOA members, board members, even Karen herself, demanding to know what was going on. I didn't pick up. Instead, I sat back, sipping my coffee, waiting for the fireworks to begin. And oh, did they begin. By 3 p.m., Karen was on my doorstep, fuming, her perfect blonde bob slightly out of place, something I had never seen before. "You cut off our power?" she screeched, her voice hitting a pitch that probably scared off every bird in a 2-mile radius. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I leaned against my doorframe, feigning innocence. "Oh, Karen, I'm so sorry to hear that. I didn't realize there was an issue. You see, I discovered that the HOA office was illegally using my private utility pole. Since I never signed off on that, I had no choice but to terminate the connection. Her mouth opened and closed, her face turning a delightful shade of red. "You can't do that," she finally managed to sputter. I smiled. "Oh, but I can. You see, much like how you claim I'm in violation for my shed, you're in violation for using my property without authorization. But don't worry. Once the HOA pays the appropriate reinstatement fee and files the correct permits, I'll be happy to discuss turning it back on." Her nostrils flared. "This is an abuse of power." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I agree completely." She stared at me for a long moment, her jaw clenched so tight I thought she might crack a tooth. Finally, she turned on her heel and stormed off without another word. But I knew this wasn't over. No, Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She would come back, and when she did, I would be ready. This was just the beginning. That Karen's departure was only the calm before the storm. I knew she wouldn't let this go, and sure enough, by the next morning, the HOA board had already sent out an emergency email to the entire community. It was filled with the usual dramatic nonsense. Claims of unauthorized tampering with community infrastructure, reckless endangerment of neighborhood resources, and my personal favorite, deliberate sabotage intended to disrupt the HOA's ability to function effectively. I couldn't help but laugh at that last one, as if cutting off the power to their little dictatorship was some grand crime, while they had left me sitting in the dark over a shed. The hypocrisy was almost impressive. Then came the threats. By midday, I had received 3 official-looking letters taped to my door, all filled with the kind of legal jargon that was meant to scare people into submission. Fines, penalties, further action will be taken if non-compliance continues. Standard HOA intimidation tactics. But what Karen and her little band of rule-obsessed cronies didn't realize was that I wasn't just some clueless homeowner they could push around. I had already forwarded every single one of their letters to my lawyer, and Bill had responded with a beautifully worded legal notice of his own. It outlined the very simple fact that since the HOA had no legally documented right to use my utility pole, their power outage was their problem, not mine. Karen, of course, refused to accept that. That afternoon, I was outside watering my lawn when I saw her pacing back and forth outside the HOA office, barking orders at a group of electricians she had clearly called in to try and fix the issue. Her arms flailed wildly as she pointed toward my property, and even from across the street, I could see the frustration etched into her face. I smirked. She had met her match, and she knew it. The real entertainment started when the electricians finally came knocking on my door. One of them, a young guy who looked way too nervous for someone just doing his job, cleared his throat and explained that the HOA had hired them to restore power, but they needed access to the utility pole. I simply crossed my arms and asked if they had a permit. The poor guy blinked in confusion. A permit? Of course, they didn't have one. I could see Karen standing across the street, hands on her hips, practically vibrating with fury. I leaned against my door frame, enjoying the moment. I made sure to explain, loudly enough for Karen to hear, that without proper authorization, touching anything on my property would be considered trespassing, and I would have no choice but to call the police. The electricians looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable, before one of them finally muttered that they'd have to get back to me. They left, and, as expected, Karen stormed over not 5 minutes later, her face red with anger. I didn't even have to say anything before she launched into one of her classic HOA speeches, going on about community responsibilities, how I was setting a dangerous precedent, how my selfishness was harming the entire neighborhood. She acted as if I had personally torn the power lines down with my bare hands instead of simply enforcing my property rights. The best part was when she tried to demand that I sign an agreement allowing the HOA continued access to the pole. She actually thought I was dumb enough to put my signature on something that would let her keep abusing her power indefinitely. Instead of responding, I simply pulled out my phone and started recording. That shut her up real fast. Her eyes flickered between my phone and my face, and for the first time, I saw a sliver of doubt creep into her expression. She knew what I was doing. If she kept yelling, if she kept threatening, it would all be on record. And HOA presidents like Karen thrived on power that was kept behind closed doors, in hushed conversations where they could bully people without consequences. She had no idea how to handle someone like me, someone who wasn't just going to cave under pressure. After an awkward few seconds of silence, she did what Karen always did when she didn't get her way. She stormed off, muttering under her breath about how this wasn't over. And I knew she meant it. She wasn't the type to let something like this go. But what she didn't know was that I had already started preparing my next move. That evening, I got a call from one of my neighbors, an older gentleman named Frank who had lived in the community for decades. Unlike most of the HOA loyalists, Frank had never cared for their nonsense, and he had a deep disdain for Karen and her ridiculous rules. He chuckled over the phone, telling me that the HOA office had been in complete chaos all day, with board members arguing over how to handle the situation. But the best part? Apparently, their phones had also gone down. Turns out, the HOA's internet and landline services were also running through the same power supply that had been cut off. I grinned. I hadn't even realized that when I disconnected them, but it made perfect sense. Karen's whole little operation relied on that office, and without power, they couldn't send out their mass emails, print out their violation notices, or hold their pointless meetings. It was a beautiful accident, and I intended to make the most of it. The next morning, I woke up to find yet another notice on my door, but this one was different. Instead of a fine or a threat, it was a summons. The HOA had officially filed a complaint against me, claiming that my actions were causing harm to the community. They wanted a hearing, and they wanted it fast. I shook my head, laughing to myself. Karen really didn't know when to quit. But if she thought dragging me into some HOA kangaroo court was going to scare me, she had another thing coming. Because I had a plan that would not only shut her down, but would make sure she never messed with me or anyone else in the neighborhood again. This wasn't just about power anymore. This was about proving a point. And I was going to make sure Karen regretted ever picking a fight with me. By the time the HOA hearing rolled around, I was more than ready. Karen had spent the past few days scrambling, trying to regain control of the situation, but without power in the HOA office, she was severely handicapped. No emails, no phone calls, no endless printed notices. She had been forced to rely on word of mouth, which meant that for once, people were actually talking about the situation instead of just blindly following her orders. And what I had been hearing was promising. Many homeowners were starting to question Karen's leadership. Some were annoyed that the HOA office had been shut down, but more of them were starting to see the bigger picture. How Karen had abused her power for years, enforcing ridiculous rules and fines just to maintain control. And now that she was finally being challenged, she was spiraling. The meeting was held at the community center, the only place big enough to fit the crowd that had gathered. Normally, HOA meetings were quiet affairs, attended only by board members and the occasional homeowner who had been dragged in to face some fabricated violation. But this time, the room was packed. People weren't just sitting in chairs. They were standing along the walls, murmuring to each other, eager to see what was going to happen. The energy was different. This wasn't just another HOA hearing. This was a showdown. Karen sat at the head of the room, flanked by the other board members, her face stretched into a tight, forced smile. She was trying to maintain her usual air of superiority, but I could see the tension in her posture, the way she clutched her clipboard like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She had expected me to come alone, to be intimidated by the crowd, but she had underestimated me. I had come prepared. My lawyer, Bill, was seated beside me, his expression calm and composed. He had seen cases like this before, HOAs pushing their luck, overstepping their legal boundaries, and he knew exactly how to handle them. Karen wasted no time launching into her speech. She went on and on about community standards, about how my reckless actions had caused distress and inconvenience to the neighborhood. She painted herself as the victim, claiming that my refusal to comply with HOA guidelines had forced her hand. She tried to make it seem like I was the one being unreasonable, like I had left her with no choice but to disconnect my power. But as she spoke, I could see the way people in the crowd were reacting. Some were nodding along, but others were whispering, exchanging skeptical glances. They had heard my side of the story, and for the first time, they were starting to question whether Karen was really acting in their best interests. When she finally finished, Bill stood up, straightened his tie, and calmly laid out her case. He explained, in simple legal terms, that Karen had no authority to cut off my power, that the HOA had no documented right to use my utility pole, and that their office had been operating on my private property without permission for years. He produced the documents proving it, holding them up for everyone to see. And then he pointed out something even more damning. Because the HOA office was technically running on unauthorized infrastructure, any decisions made or fines issued during that time could be considered legally questionable. A murmur ran through the crowd as people processed what that meant. If Bill was right, and he was, then Karen had not only lost her power, but she had also lost her ability to enforce any of the rules she had been using to control the community. The room fell silent as the realization sank in. Karen had spent years lording over the neighborhood, fining people for minor infractions, dictating what they could and couldn't do with their own homes. And now all of that power was slipping through her fingers. She tried to fight back, of course. She stood up, her voice sharp and desperate, arguing that the HOA bylaws gave her the authority to make decisions in the best interest of the community. But Bill didn't even flinch. He simply held up another document, an official county notice stating that the HOA's use of my utility pole had never been legally recorded. And because of that, their office's connection had been unauthorized from the very beginning. The room exploded. People started talking over each other, asking questions, demanding answers. Some were furious, realizing that they had been paying HOA dues to an organization that had been operating illegally. Others were laughing, openly mocking Karen for getting caught in her own web of control. And through it all, Karen stood there, her face growing redder by the second, completely unable to regain control of the situation. Then, the final blow came. Bill handed out a stack of printed notices, informing every homeowner that because of the HOA's illegal actions, they had grounds to dispute any fines they had paid under Karen's leadership. If they wanted, they could sue to have their money refunded. And if enough people took action, the HOA could be financially crippled. That was when Karen finally snapped. She slammed her clipboard onto the table and shouted over the chaos, her voice shrill with panic. She accused me of conspiring against her, of manipulating the situation to destroy the HOA. But no one was listening anymore. The crowd had turned against her completely. People were standing up, demanding a vote to remove her as president. Someone in the back called out that they should just shut down the HOA entirely. The board members looked at each other, unsure of what to do, as the voices in the room grew louder and louder. And then the most beautiful thing happened. One of the older board members, a quiet man who had never spoken much during these meetings, finally stood up. He cleared his throat, waited for the room to settle, and then, in a steady voice, said that perhaps it was time for a change. That maybe the HOA had been mismanaged for too long. That maybe, just maybe, Karen had done more harm than good. The vote happened right then and there. It wasn't even close. Nearly every hand in the room went up in favor of removing Karen as president. Even a few of her former allies hesitated before slowly raising their hands. Karen's face went pale. She shook her head, as if refusing to believe what was happening. She opened her mouth to protest, but no one was listening. The decision had been made. And just like that, her reign was over. Karen sat frozen in her chair, gripping the edge of the table like she was trying to hold on to the last bit of power she had left. The room was buzzing with voices, neighbors shaking hands, laughing, and whispering about what had just happened. It was over, and everyone knew it. She had ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist for years, making life miserable for anyone who dared to challenge her authority. But now, in the span of a single meeting, everything had crumbled. Her own board had abandoned her. The homeowners had turned against her, and the power she had wielded so ruthlessly had been stripped away in an instant. She tried to recover, to gather the shreds of her dignity, standing up slowly as if she still had some authority left. But it was too late. Nobody was looking at her with fear or respect anymore. The spell had been broken. People who had once tiptoed around her, too afraid to challenge her ridiculous rules, were now openly celebrating her downfall. Someone in the back was already making plans to file for reimbursement for the fines they had paid over the years. A small group was discussing whether they should dissolve the HOA completely. Karen's eyes darted across the room, looking for support, but all she found were cold stares and smirks. Even the board members who had once been loyal to her were avoiding eye contact, pretending to be busy shuffling papers or adjusting their chairs. She opened her mouth, maybe to defend herself, maybe to make one last desperate plea, but no one cared anymore. Her voice had lost its power. The final humiliation came when one of the newer board members, a middle-aged woman who had clearly had enough of Karen's nonsense, stood up and announced that they would be filing an official report to the county about the misuse of funds and the illegal power connection. That meant Karen wasn't just losing her position. She might actually face legal consequences for her actions. Her face turned ghostly pale at that. It was one thing to be voted out. It was another thing entirely to be investigated. She snatched up her clipboard, her hands shaking slightly, and stormed toward the door, but she couldn't leave without one last attempt at control. She spun around at the exit, glaring at me with pure hatred. Everyone else might have turned against her, but in her mind, this was still my fault. I had embarrassed her, exposed her, ruined everything she had built. She was seething, but she knew she couldn't lash out like she normally would. Not now. Not with the entire neighborhood watching. So instead, she straightened her back, tried to put on that old, smug expression, and said something about how the neighborhood would fall apart without her leadership, how I had doomed everyone to chaos. Nobody reacted. There was no last-minute sympathy, no one rushing to her defense. Just silence. And that, more than anything, seemed to break her. She let out a frustrated huff and turned on her heel, marching out of the community center and into the night, slamming the door behind her. The moment she was gone, the room erupted into cheers. People clapped, some even laughed out loud. Someone brought out a bottle of wine from a bag and started pouring drinks. It felt like a celebration, a long-overdue victory. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before were shaking hands, exchanging stories about their run-ins with Karen over the years. It was like the neighborhood had been holding its breath for too long, and now, finally, it could breathe again. I didn't stick around for too long. I had won, and that was all that mattered. As I walked home, I took in the quiet streets, the houses glowing warmly in the night. This place had felt like a prison under Karen's rule, but now it felt different. Free. By the next morning, word had spread like wildfire. People who hadn't even attended the meeting were already talking about it. Someone had recorded the whole thing and uploaded it online, and within hours, it had circulated through the neighborhood. Karen had officially become a joke, a cautionary tale of what happens when power goes unchecked. And the best part? The HOA had no leadership now. With Karen gone, the remaining board members were scrambling to figure out what to do next, but it was clear that things were never going to be the same again. Later that afternoon, I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the peaceful silence, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Frank, the old neighbor who had always hated the HOA as much as I did. He had sent me a link to a local news article. Apparently, Karen had already filed a complaint against the community for unlawful treatment and was demanding to be reinstated. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my drink. She really didn't know when to quit, but no one was taking her seriously anymore. Her reputation was shattered. Her influence was gone. And as far as the neighborhood was concerned, she was nothing more than a bitter ex-dictator clinging to a past that no longer existed. The HOA, once the most feared organization in the community, was now a mess of confusion and infighting, with no clear leadership and no power to enforce their ridiculous rules. And I was free. My power was back on. My property was mine again, and Karen was nothing more than a bad memory. As I watched the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, I let out a long, satisfied sigh. It was over. Finally, truly over. And for the first time in years, I could enjoy my home without the shadow of the HOA hanging over me. Justice had been served. Days passed, and the neighborhood was adjusting to life without Karen's iron grip. There was an almost tangible sense of relief, like a collective exhale after years of suffocating under her endless rules and fines. People had started making little changes, porch lights staying on past her ridiculous curfew, garden gnomes reappearing on lawns without fear of penalty, even a couple of kids setting up a lemonade stand without an immediate shutdown order. It was a quiet rebellion, but an effective one. The HOA still technically existed, but without Karen dictating every move, it was weak, scrambling to function. The remaining board members were disorganized, half of them probably considering stepping down, while the other half debated whether to dissolve the HOA altogether. Karen, however, was far from done. If there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that she couldn't handle losing. She had spent years lording over this neighborhood, convincing herself that she was indispensable, that without her, everything would collapse. But instead of the chaos she had predicted, life had simply moved on without her. And that, more than the loss of power, more than the public humiliation, was what she couldn't stand. The first sign that she was plotting something came in the form of a letter, slipped under my door in the dead of night. It was unsigned, but I knew exactly who it was from. It was filled with desperate accusations, claiming that I had corrupted the community, that my actions had destroyed the integrity of the neighborhood, that I was single-handedly responsible for tearing apart the foundation she had built. She went on about how the HOA would be reinstated under new leadership, that people were already rallying behind her, that soon the mess I had created would be fixed. It was laughable. No one was going to follow her again. But the fact that she was still trying told me one thing. She wasn't done fighting. The second sign came when I noticed a strange car parked outside my house one evening, just sitting there with the headlights off. At first, I assumed it was a nosy neighbor, but after watching it for a while, I realized the engine was still running. Whoever was inside wasn't just passing through. They were watching. It sat there for nearly an hour before finally pulling away. I wasn't paranoid enough to think Karen would do anything drastic, but I also wasn't stupid enough to ignore it. The next day, I decided to be proactive. I went down to the county office to officially file a complaint against the HOA for years of improper fines and unauthorized use of my property. With the evidence I had gathered, there was a strong chance that they would be forced to pay back thousands of dollars to the homeowners they had wrongfully fined over the years. If Karen was planning a comeback, she was about to find out just how deep the hole she had dug for herself really was. By the time I got back home, the neighborhood was buzzing again, but this time for a different reason. A new set of letters had gone out, and this time they were signed. Karen was officially announcing her return, claiming that she had been unfairly removed, that the vote was illegitimate, that she was challenging it in court. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. She had spent so long ruling this neighborhood like a queen that she had convinced herself she was invincible. But the truth was, no one wanted her back. People were openly mocking her letter, laughing about it in their driveways, shaking their heads at how desperate she had become. Still, I knew Karen well enough to know that she wasn't just going to stop with strongly worded letters. She was going to try something else, something bigger, something that she thought would put her back on top. And sure enough, she did. That weekend, in the middle of the night, the power went out. But this time, it wasn't just my house. It was the entire neighborhood. Every single home, every street lamp, every security camera. The whole community was plunged into darkness. I stepped outside and saw neighbors gathering on their porches, confused, checking their breaker boxes, calling the electric company. But I already knew this wasn't some random outage. This was Karen. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the main utility box at the end of the street, the one that controlled the power grid for the entire neighborhood. And that's when I saw it. Karen, standing there with a pair of bolt cutters in her hand, looking completely unhinged. She wasn't alone. A man, someone I didn't recognize, was crouched next to the electrical panel, working quickly to manipulate the wiring. She turned when she saw me, her face twisted in triumph, as if she thought she had finally won. This was her big move, her desperate attempt to prove that without her, the neighborhood would fall apart. If she couldn't have power, then no one would. The problem was, she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because now, this wasn't just an HOA dispute. Now it was a crime. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I pulled out my phone, already dialing 911. Karen's smug expression faltered when she realized what I was doing, and she started barking orders at the man next to her. telling him to hurry up, to finish what he was doing. But it was too late. The sound of sirens cut through the night air, growing louder by the second. Karen spun around, eyes wide, realizing just how badly she had messed up. She dropped the bolt cutters, took a step back as if she was thinking about running, but there was nowhere to go. The police cars came to a screeching halt, their flashing lights illuminating the scene. Officers jumped out, demanding that both Karen and her accomplice step away from the electrical box. Neighbors had started gathering now, watching as Karen was forced to put her hands up, her grand plan unraveling right in front of everyone. The officer closest to her wasted no time telling her exactly what she was being arrested for: tampering with public utilities, criminal trespassing, property damage. Her accomplice, who I later learned was her cousin, tried to talk his way out of it, claiming they were just checking the lines, but it was no use. The evidence was right there, and they were both caught red-handed. Karen screamed about injustice, about how she was being set up, how this was all my fault. But the officers didn't care. They hauled her into the back of the police car, her face a mixture of rage and disbelief. She had spent so long thinking she was above the rules, but now she was learning the hard way that she wasn't. The moment the car doors slammed shut, the entire neighborhood erupted into cheers. People clapped, some even popped open beers right there in the street. It was over. Really, truly over. Karen wasn't just removed from power. She was gone, taken away in handcuffs. Her reign officially ended. The power company arrived shortly after to restore the electricity, and within an hour, everything was back to normal. The neighborhood, free at last from Karen's grasp, had never felt so alive. People lingered outside, chatting, laughing, basking in the victory. And me? I just stood there, taking it all in. This war had started with her cutting off my power. And in the end, the only one left in the dark was her.